This is not a complete history of England, English football, or the year 1985. It's an overview of English football's annus horribilis. Many on and off-field events shaped society and the football world during the 1980s, some of them especially tragic. Some of these disasters feature in this video, but we do not cover them or other events in the depth that they deserve here. We have plans to look at various events from the 1980s that changed the game and reshaped society and culture in more detail in the future. Viewed from a safe distance, English football in the 1980s is often romanticised and glorified as the last great full decade for the sport in the country. Entry to stadiums cost a fraction of what it does today, and you could usually pay at the gate. Then, when you were inside, you could scour the terraces for the perfect spot, and even move if you fancied a different view a little later on. Players made decent but not exorbitant money, and were less like elite athletes and more like your dad, up for a midweek 10-pinter and a bare-knuckle chat in the pub car park. The FA Cup was at peak magic, and you could buy cod and chips, 2 pickled eggs, and 6 cans of ale for 4 crow's feet and half a newt's tail. But the 1980s was a truly tumultuous decade for English football, with several tragic low points. When rock bottom was finally hit, the only feasible solution was a revolution. When looking for the worst year in the decade, 1985 doesn't even need to dip for the line. As a collective 12 months, the national game confronted years of violence, stadium neglect, and social decay. Before we dive into the mid-decade debacle, let's colour in some context. England failed to qualify for the 1974 and 1978 World Cups. They also didn't qualify for the 1972 and 1976 European Championships. They then failed to qualify for the 1984 tournament too, along with all the other home nations. As a result, the main broadcasters, BBC and ITV, decided it wasn't even worth broadcasting the showpiece in France live on television. With no British representation, what was the point in dedicating precious airtime to live football? Like the national team, the English game had slid into disrepute and ignominy. This despite English teams dominating the European Cup from the late 1970s. But there were little to no casual football fans as the mid-80s approached. The game was simply too toxic. The common perception was that football fans were idiots, hooligans, criminals in waiting, or a seductive mix of all four. A lingering threat of serious violence hung over stadiums and the surrounding streets on match days. And those stadiums, most of which had been built in the early 20th century and into war years, were decrepit and crumbling with the most basic animalistic facilities, and often no facilities at all for women. It's no surprise then that average attendances were tumbling. In 1973, the average Division 1 attendance was 30,257. Over the following years, it fell into the high 20,000s. From 1980 to 1984, the averages were 26,327, 24,682, 22,556, 20,126, 18,834. Some numbers for you there. Following one of the tragedies in 1985, an article in the Sunday Times described football as a slum sport played in slum stadiums and increasingly watched by slum people. As this awful year unfolded, it was a sentiment shared by many across the country. The first notable flashpoint came only 5 days into the year, on the 5th of January. Burton Albion, then a part-time outfit in the Northern Premier League, faced off against Division 1 Leicester, who had Gary Lineker and Alan Smith leading the line. With the two teams separated by less than 30 miles, and given the constant threat of hooliganism across the country, The game was moved to a neutral venue, Derby County's baseball ground, for safety reasons. As Burton's goalkeeper and captain, Paul Evans, recalls, it didn't take long for the trouble to start. Someone threw a can in the goalmouth just after the start, so I picked it up. It was full of sand. The fans behind the goal threw coins towards the pitch too, one of which hit Evans. However, a far heavier block of wood followed, striking Evans on the head and knocking him out. The game was paused as Evans' teammates and manager, Neil Warnock, checked on his condition. In The Guardian's That 1980s Sports blog, Evans describes feeling nauseated, vomiting on the pitch, and then continuing to throw up in the changing room at half-time. In the meantime, Evans had conceded 2 more goals, both of which he has no memory of. Having made their one permitted substitution, Evans wanted to play on. Reluctant to go down to 10 men, Burton allowed it. The score finished 6-1 to Leicester, but there was considerable fallout. Burton appealed on principle. The Burton manager, Warnock, said, "Whoever is playing, hooligans must not be allowed the opportunity of altering the course of a match." With the finger of blame pointing at Leicester fans, their club secretary, Alan Bennett, came out swinging. Of the 6,000 tickets sold behind the goal, only 1,828 were issued by Leicester. The rest were sold at the gate on the day to anyone. There were incidents earlier in the match when Leicester fans behind the goal were hit by missiles from the stand above. The feeling was that the culprits were Derby people. Naturally, this didn't go down well in Derby. But Bennett's words did raise a valid point. Anyone could turn up on the day of a game and pay at the turnstiles. If enough people were intent on causing violence at a football game, any football game, whether it was their team playing or not, they could. The FA ordered a replay behind closed doors, choosing to send a message that crowd violence must not be seen to pay. Ultimately, Leicester finally saw off Burton 1-0 at an all but empty Highfield Road in Coventry. Between March 1984 and March 1985, coal miners in the north of England and parts of Scotland went on strike in an attempt to resist the closure of pits that the government deemed uneconomic. The coal industry was nationalised and had been since 1947. There are numerous links between football, the miners' strike, and the mining heartlands, and we hope to explore them in more detail in later videos, so we'll be brief here. In the context of 1985, it's important to note that the strike officially ended on the 3rd of March. Defeated by the Thatcher government, the miners trudged back to work. The impact on communities and, by extension, football fans and clubs was regionalised. The strike hadn't affected the electricity supply in the UK, so life carried on as normal for many people in the south of the country. While class and political beliefs viciously divided communities in the epicentre of the strike, it wasn't uncommon for people living hundreds of miles away to barely give it a second thought. But plenty of famous footballing voices expressed their opinions, and it probably comes as no surprise that one of them was Brian Clough. The then Nottingham Forest manager was an ardent supporter of miners and mining communities, arguing that all right-minded working-class fans should contribute towards the Miners' Fund. England World Cup winner Jack Charlton, a former miner himself, lent picketers his car to travel across the country. Returning to Clough, his strident views came against a controversial backdrop in Nottinghamshire. Most of the county's miners chose to carry on working, leaving whole towns and villages divided between strikers and scabs, those who crossed the picket line. Naturally, this approach outraged those out on strike. Today, there's still animosity between Sheffield United and Nottingham Forest fans, although, depending on who you ask, the hatred flows more in one direction. Chesterfield-Mansfield fixtures, once simply known as a Derbyshire-Nottinghamshire rivalry, became far more ferocious after the industrial action of 1984-85, to the extent that these games are referred to today as the Miners' Strike Derby. But back to the strike. We're supposed to be keeping this short. The government mobilised the full force of the police, the courts, and the British media to crush the miners. culminating with the sickening scenes at the Battle of Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984. The South Yorkshire police that was unleashed at Orgreave was the same force at the heart of the Hillsborough disaster and cover-up 5 years later. In an article titled "Orgreave was part of the class war that ended with 96 dead at Hillsborough," this was written before Andrew Devine passed away in 2021, becoming the 97th victim. Owen Jones writes, "In the 1980s, the police were politicised, transformed into blunt instruments as part of a wider, concerted mission to neutralise the British Labour movement. It was in this context that South Yorkshire police were encouraged to dehumanise striking miners, to see them as violent, extremist, enemy within scum. When they violently charged at miners, lied about their behaviour with the complicity of the British media, dictated false witness statements, and tried to stitch up their victims, they began a long march that ended in the Hillsborough disaster and 96 dead Liverpool fans. It was class war, and it ended with bodies sprawled in make-do mortuaries." An oral history created by Professor Robert Gildea and Professor Jim Phillips at Oxford University's Faculty of History also states that the Thatcher government's strategy was to close the collieries, break the miners' union and the labour movement in general, and open the way to a free market economy in which deregulated financial capitalism would be set free by the Big Bang of 1986. The government's contempt for the working classes and unshakable desire to destroy two bastions of the British working class, football and the coal industry, ultimately brought about a resounding victory. The miners had been crushed. The titans of finance and the neoliberal ideologues who released them had secured a resounding victory. Indeed, Thatcher's conquest of the miners and her government's dismantling of the labour movement had an unprecedented impact on British life over the coming decades, including, by extension, the creation of the Premier League. What followed in the national game was the definition of gentrification, a phenomenon that would later worm its way into the downtrodden parts of cities across the country. A run-down, sneered-at entity on its knees, scooped up by ambitious moneymen, presumably referring to themselves as disruptors and visionaries, shaken free of its cash-strapped, uneducated population and transformed into a glossy, sanitized, soulless commodity that deifies the American model. In early 1985, unemployment levels in the UK reached 12%. Andrew Marr notes in his History of Modern Britain, two Britons emerged as the decade wore on. The rich got richer, but the bottom 10% saw their incomes fall by about 17%. A lot of people fell through the cracks. Once Britain had prided itself on not seeing people sleeping on the streets or begging. Not anymore. The miners' strike was symbolic of the dismantling of the British working class. The long-standing sense of belonging once found at work and in communities dwindled or disappeared entirely. Britain's coal industry was on the road to annihilation, and the deindustrialization process eviscerated once powerful cities and transformed the economy, creating new winners and losers. The failure of the strike paved the way for privatization of nationalized industries, including steel, railways, gas, telecoms, and water, all part of the wider globalization process that would revolutionize the world. The era of neoliberalism, rampant capitalism, never-ending growth, and the eternal search for record profits was ushered in. Within a decade or so, English football would be unrecognisable. The FA Cup sixth-round tie between Luton and Millwall has gone down in infamy. While it was a particularly shocking example of the hooliganism that had taken the game hostage and broadcast live on primetime TV, hundreds of similar incidents had taken place across the country and continent over the years. Only days earlier, on the 4th of March, Chelsea hosted Sunderland in the League Cup semi-final second leg. When the tie slipped beyond Chelsea, Blues fans invaded the pitch in an attempt to fight the Sunderland following. Instead, they tangled with police, missiles flying through the air. 104 people were arrested and 40 people were injured, including 20 police officers and stewards. Legend has it that a mounted policeman was in the penalty area when Colin West scored Sunderland's third goal. At the final whistle, some home supporters again invaded the pitch, getting close enough to players to throw punches at them. And later in the year, Liverpool and Manchester United played out a notorious 2-2 draw at Goodison Park in the FA Cup semi-final. Stanley Park's surroundings and the narrow streets of Luton became a battleground for young fans of both teams. In the bear pit of a stadium, missiles flew through the air, including the infamous nail-embedded golf balls. Trouble flared throughout the game in the corners of Goodison, where the two sets of fans butted up against each other. By 1985, Millwall's association with hooliganism was, to put it plainly, well established. The Bushwhackers, a hooligan firm tied to Millwall that had evolved from the original F-Troop firm, was among the most notorious in the country. The FA had closed the Den, Millwall's home ground, on numerous occasions following crowd violence, and the club had received fines for these incidents too. Given that Luton had their own MIG firm, Millwall requested that their opponents make the game all ticket to reduce the chances of incidents. Luton ignored the proposal. The following travelling up from London was disproportionately large for a Millwall away game. In fact, it was twice the size of the club's average home attendance. In an article for 442 magazine, Richard Edwards writes, "Inexplicably, the FA Cup quarter-final between Luton and Millwall wasn't an all-ticket affair, which gave Lions supporters carte blanche to rope in some help from fans of Chelsea and West Ham in a rampage that further stained the already far from spotless reputation of English fans, both domestically and, crucially, in Europe." Rampage is one way to describe it. Riot seems more accurate. As early as 5 p.m. that evening, newsagents and pubs in Luton were reporting trouble and smashed windows. Come 7 o'clock, the vast terrace of the Kenilworth Road stand, allocated to away fans, was overflowing. Around 7:10, some of the away following scaled the fences at the front of the stand and rushed down the pitch, heading for the Luton supporters in the Oak Road end. They threw cans, bottles, nails and coins, causing the Luton fans to flee, or at least try. With fans still entering the stand prior to kick-off, there was nowhere for so many people to go. The hooligans then turned their attention to the Bobbers stand, tearing out seats to use as weapons. In the meantime, the players had attempted to come out and warm up, but had understandably headed straight back down the tunnel. The scoreboard displayed a message saying that the game wouldn't start until order was restored. It was ignored. Millwall manager George Graham appealed for the hooligans to return to the stand, but they ignored him too. It was only the combination of Graham's presence on the sideline and the arrival of police dogs that finally restored relative peace. However, some isolated fights continued to break out as the away fans found their way into other parts of the ground. When the game did start, it only lasted 14 minutes before fans spilled onto the pitch again. Given what had come before, the referee didn't hesitate to take the players back down the tunnel. After a 24-minute delay, play resumed. Somehow, the match reached its conclusion, Luton winning 1-0. A bolstered police presence managed to keep the crowd in the stands, for the most part. Luton's goalkeeper, Les Seeley, had to stand in front of the Millwall following in the second half and was hit on the head with a missile. A match steward was also hit with a chair, and a knife was found in Seeley's goalmouth after the game. At the final whistle, both sets of players sprinted off the pitch as hooligans poured onto it. They continued to tear seats out of the Bobbers stand, hurling them onto the field and toward the police. Initially, the hooligans on the field outnumbered the law, forcing them to retreat, but the police regrouped and charged in waves, batons drawn. Amidst the riot, Sergeant Colin Cook was struck on the head with a concrete block. He fell in the centre circle and stopped breathing. A fellow officer, PC Phil Evans, managed to resuscitate Cook despite being kicked, punched and hit with the concrete himself. A running battle between the London following and the police continued outside the ground after the game, resulting in damage to homes, shops and cars. The Luton chairman at the time was David Evans, a close confidant of Margaret Thatcher. His club's stadium had been trashed, so he didn't waste the opportunity to win the Prime Minister's favour. He banned all away fans from Luton's games and introduced an ID scheme, planting the seed for Thatcher to do the same nationwide. Evans's actions were criticised by the Football League and loathed by fans. Then Luton manager David Pleat said, "He was a naughty boy, David. He was Mrs. Thatcher's plaything. He wanted a safe Tory seat. I didn't agree with it, but there was no discussion, no debate." Evans was elected as MP for Welwyn Hatfield, a safe Tory seat, in 1987. After the Conservatives retained power in the 1983 election, the Thatcherite project was consolidated. This was the death knell for Britain's traditional manufacturing sector, but football was in the crosshairs too. Margaret Thatcher had no interest in sports, and she loathed football. Such was the Conservative attitude at the time that the national game was seen as a law and order issue. The appalling scenes at Kenilworth Road and those around the country gave credence to this attitude. For all the non-violent, non-idiotic fans, the hooligan faction simply continued to grow and destroy. In 1983, the Chester Report analysed the Football League's structure. As David Goldblatt writes in The Game of Our Lives, the Chester Report opted for a form of rationally managed decline, a defeatist but humane social demographic restructuring. In short, this meant greater professionalism from the clubs, a greater focus on commercialism, a more comfortable fan experience, and a smaller top division and league pyramid as a whole, under which the lower tiers would be regionalised. Tragic incidents to follow in May 1985 would propel the issue further, but around 2 weeks after the Luton riot, Thatcher met with FA and Football League officials in Downing Street. She presented a 6-point plan to regain control of a situation that had been allowed to spiral. Her proposals included more CCTV, an ID card scheme that would vet fans and ban convicted hooligans, and better fencing around pitches. Later in the month, Chelsea chairman Ken Bates would take the latter to an extreme by installing electric fences at Stamford Bridge in a desperate attempt to curb the hooligan element. Despite the headlines, Bates soon had the fences dismantled as the local council refused him permission to turn them on. More a list of demands than recommendations, Thatcher was now insisting that football clubs tackle the problem head on, something that she believed they had shirked for too long. Clubs had 6 weeks to get their houses in order. By the end of May, however, the landscape had irreversibly changed. On Saturday, the 11th of May, 1985, 2 tragic incidents took place that resulted in the completely avoidable loss of life of match-going football fans. It was the final day of the season. In Division 2, Birmingham hosted Leeds United at St Andrews. Both clubs had notorious hooligan followings, so it didn't take long for trouble to flare up. A toxic atmosphere bubbled along throughout the game, occasionally boiling over. At the final whistle, Birmingham fans invaded the pitch, trying, but ultimately failing, to reach the Leeds fans. Later in the year, the Popplewell Committee investigation into crowd safety at sports grounds described the scenes at St Andrews as more like the Battle of Agincourt than a football match. The crowds ripped down fences, tore out seats, threw missiles, and set fire to a refreshment bar. Only charges by police horses kept the fans apart, preventing a full-scale riot. A police officer on the day, Detective Chief Superintendent Mick Treble, described it as the most terrifying experience I had in my police career. The intensity, the anger, the violence shown by Leeds fans was something else. Ian Hambridge was a 15-year-old boy attending his first football game with school friends. During the chaos, he was separated from the group. It is believed that Ian sought shelter away from the trouble. However, as a result of the sickening scenes, a 12-foot wall collapsed and landed on Ian, inflicting fatal head injuries. He died in hospital the following day. That same afternoon, 130 miles north, Bradford welcomed Lincoln to Valley Parade. Before the game, again the final of the season, Bradford City were presented with the 3rd Division Championship trophy. With promotion secured, there was a party atmosphere in the air. At around 3:40, 5 minutes before half-time, a fire broke out beneath the main stand. The antiquated structure primarily consisted of timber, and the roof was asphalt-covered tarpaulin, designed to make the stand rainproof, although such qualities were a distant memory. As Paul Frith recalled in 4 Minutes to Hell, the story of the Bradford City fire, most summers another patch or two was added to the different shades of asphalt, making it a patchwork of repairs that never truly fixed the problem. In fact, the stand stood in a remarkably similar state as the one erected way back in 1908, 4 years before the Titanic sunk. The stand was unusual in many ways too. First, it was built into a valley, meaning the pitch was considerably lower than the level of the street outside. As a result, there was a cavity beneath the wooden terraces and seating areas. Over the years, a significant amount of rubbish had accumulated in the cavity, in part due to the gaps in the floorboards above. Some estimates claim the litter had gathered for over half a century. However, in his book, 56, The Story of the Bradford Fire, Martin Fletcher states that groundsman Alan Gilliver also told the inquiry there wasn't as much rubbish as everyone makes out there was, and that it had been removed during pre-season repairs. Second, the seating and standing arrangements inside the stand were odd and confusing. The stand had 3 sections, which Paul Frith described as follows. Upper rows of wooden seats on wooden floorboards. The lower rows, which by 1985 were plastic seats with metal supports set in concrete. And, lastly, the standing areas. The aisles and their downward steps could confuse the occasional and unwary visitor. Without telling you which was which, some of the aisles only went halfway down the rows of seats, and this was a source of frustration for those trying to find a seat in the lower section. What's more, the stand was designed to try and keep passage between these sections to a minimum, or impossible. A wooden wall around 4 feet high separated the upper seating area from the lower seating section and had only 2 openings for fans to pass through. At the front of the lower seating area, there was a drop of about 5 feet down to the standing area, the paddock, and, as Frith notes, was not intended to be negotiated by spectators in either direction. Then, at the front of the paddock, the lower walkway was below pitch level by a couple of feet. Thus, the pitchside wall, which looked barely 3 or 4 feet high when seen from the far side of the pitch, was something like 5 feet high for anyone standing at the front of the paddock. In less than 4 minutes, the wisps of grey smoke first seen at 3:40 had become a ferocious fire that engulfed the wooden structure, killing 56 people and injuring at least 265 more. The club had been due to redevelop the stand with concrete terracing and a steel roof 2 days later. In 1981 alone, the Health and Safety Executive twice drew the club's attention to the fire risk. The County Council did the same again in 1984, but the rubbish wasn't cleared, or at least not entirely, and even if some had been, it was allowed to reaccumulate. According to the Popplewell inquiry, the fire was accidental, most likely caused by a discarded cigarette that fell through one of the gaps in the floorboards. It then ignited the rubbish beneath, and the subsequent blaze consumed everything. In an article in The Athletic, the coroner James Turnbull is quoted as saying that the fire went from one end to the other quicker than anybody could walk. For some reason, the Popplewell inquiry was a joint investigation into the events at St Andrews and Valley Parade. before later having its remit extended to include the Heysel disaster. Turnbull calls this political business, claiming it was designed to talk to the politicians about the dangers in football stadia, rather than truly getting to the root of the tragedies. The somewhat rushed inquiry resulted in new legislation. This included the banning of new wooden stands, the immediate closure of existing stands classed as unsafe, and the banning of smoking in wooden stands. We can only scratch the surface of the Bradford fire here. If you're watching this around release, we will have a dedicated video about the disaster coming soon. If you're coming to this later, be sure to check out that video after this. We will put the link in the description when it's live. Liverpool and Juventus contested the 1985 European Cup final at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels. What unfolded on that May evening was a hellish mix of hooliganism, stadium neglect, administrative failings, and incompetent policing. First, in assigning the final to Heysel, UEFA chose a crumbling, decrepit stadium for their showpiece occasion. In fact, Liverpool chief executive Peter Robinson and Juventus president Gianpiero Boniperti had both requested that UEFA change the venue, foreseeing the potential for violence, if not the scale of the tragedy itself. UEFA rejected the requests, and it later transpired that their official inspection of Heysel lasted only 30 minutes. Built between 1929 and 1930, Heysel was in a serious state of disrepair come the mid-1980s. The final was due to be the last football game played at the stadium before a huge renovation. But with this end in sight, investment in maintenance and repairs had become non-existent. Arsenal fans had already complained about Heysel's condition when their side played Valencia in the 1980 European Cup Winners' Cup final. By 1985, it was in a shocking state and entirely unfitting for a European Cup final involving two of Europe's superpowers. On the night of the game, ticketless fans were seen kicking holes in the outer wall made of breeze blocks to gain entry. After the game and subsequent tragedy, the deputy chief of the London Fire Brigade, Jerry Clarkson, investigated the stadium. He said that Heysel's condition was beyond belief and that the deaths that night were attributable very, very largely to the appalling state of the stadium. Leading Belgian architect Joseph Ange was ordered to survey the disaster scene too. He noted, "Areas for standing room remain as they were at the time of their construction in 1930. They are in an advanced state of decay. Only the handrest remains on most of the handrails. Most are unusable, and several on the point of collapse. The handrails were quickly and easily destroyed by the pressure of the crowds, which had no proper means of escape. Concrete terracing was eroded, and crucially, neither the barrier between blocks Y and Z nor the wall in block Z were strong enough to resist crowd pressure." An added layer of context is the events in the previous year's European Cup final. In 1984, Liverpool played Roma at the Stadio Olimpico in Rome. Following their victory in the Italian capital, many Liverpool fans were attacked trying to exit the stadium and in the city, with the local police taking a relaxed approach. Only a year later, the Liverpool fans, many of whom had exploited an unenforced ban on the sale of alcohol around the stadium, carried a lingering hostility that was easy to turn on another set of Italian opponents. Inside the stadium, Juventus's official fan following was allocated blocks O, N and M behind one goal. Behind the other, Liverpool's fans had blocks Y and X. Block Z was part of the neutral allocation. This meant that anyone in Brussels, a city with a large Italian population, could buy tickets for this section. Ultimately, many Juventus fans were able to get their hands on these tickets. However, because this wasn't the club's official following, most of these people were far from the hardcore. The only barrier separating blocks Y and Z was chicken wire fencing and, initially, a handful of poorly trained police officers. The Popplewell report acknowledged that, as kick-off approached, Juventus fans at their end of the stadium were involved in some clashes with the police. In his book, From Where I Was Standing, Chris Rowland notes, "This incident spurred the Liverpool fans at the other end to fire flares and throw stones into the mostly Italian-occupied Block Z. A back and forth continued between Blocks Y and Z, ratcheting tensions. Many of the missiles and weapons used were rocks and poles offered up by the shambolic stadium." Then, as noted by the Popplewell report, between 7:15 p.m. and 7:30 p.m, English fans charged Block Z. There were 3 charges. The third resulted in the Italian supporters in Block Z, who were seeking to escape, being squashed and suffocated. Charges were common among English hooligans and weren't necessarily an instigation of outright fighting. It was part of the tribal, some might say childish, concept of taking your opponent's end. With this in mind, the typical English football fan carried a fearsome reputation. For these casual fans and genuine neutrals in Block Z, the sight of the Liverpool fans breaking through the fence and running toward them was terrifying. In Fever Pitch, Nick Hornby writes, "In the end, the surprise was that these deaths were caused by something as innocuous as running, the practice that half the juvenile fans in the country indulge in, and which was intended to do nothing more than frighten the opposition and amuse the runners. The Juventus fans, many of them chic, middle-class men and women, weren't to know that though, and why should they have done? For those looking to flee, an escape route wasn't immediately obvious. A barrier blocked escape onto the pitchside area, so the mass moved toward the back of the stand. People started climbing a wall in their attempts to find safety. As the pressure built, this wall collapsed. By the end of it all, 39 people lost their lives in the stampede or suffocating under bodies. The victims included 32 Italians, 4 Belgians, 2 French, and 1 from Northern Ireland. Over 600 people were injured. The accusations and punishments were almost immediate. The very next day, Günther Schneider, a UEFA official, said, "Only the English fans were responsible. Of that there is no doubt." Margaret Thatcher echoed Schneider's statement, saying, "There are no words. There are no possible justifications. The blame is entirely for England." It wasn't a surprise then that on the 31st of May, 2 days after the tragedy, Margaret Thatcher asked the FA to withdraw English clubs from all European club competitions. Her request preempted UEFA's actions. On the 2nd of June, they ratified the ban, eventually excluding all English clubs from UEFA competitions for 5 years, with Liverpool banned for 6. Despite the culpability of Liverpool fans in the tragedy, the Football League's secretary, Graham Kelly, was furious at the idea of a blanket ban on English clubs. He knew that the English game would fall behind, and reclaiming a place in the European game's elite would be a long and arduous process. There was a sense that Thatcher seized an opportunity to put the game in its place once and for all. She hadn't received any briefing from anyone on the ground at Heysel before asking the FA to withdraw English clubs from Europe. Her request was part of a renewed push for a cleansing of the sport, including forcing football fans to carry ID cards. "We have to get the game cleaned up from this hooliganism at home," she said, "and then perhaps we shall be able to go overseas again." At the end of an 18-month investigation, Belgian judge Marina Kopieters ultimately concluded that the English fans were culpable. However, she said that the blame should be shared with Belgian police and football authorities. 26 English nationals were charged with involuntary manslaughter. 14 of these were convicted and given 3-year sentences, half of which were suspended for 5 years. During the same trial, 3 Belgians also faced charges of involuntary manslaughter for their role in the disaster. Albert Roosens, the head of the Belgian Football Association, for allowing tickets at the Liverpool end of the stadium to be sold to Juventus fans, and 2 police chiefs, Michel Kensier and Johan Meyer, who were in charge of policing at the stadium that night. Roosens received a 6-month suspended sentence, while Meyer was handed 9 months. Kensier was acquitted. As with the Bradford fire, we are planning a dedicated Heysel video in the coming months. So either keep an eye out for it or find the link in the description below if you're watching this later. As the 1984-85 season concluded, English football was at rock bottom. The Football League's first ever sponsor, Canon, announced that they wouldn't extend their 3-year deal after the 1985-86 season. Presumably, they'd had enough. But even before the tragedies that blighted the end of the season, the Football League, BBC and ITV were struggling to come to terms on a deal for broadcasting live games on TV. In February, the Football League turned down a joint BBC and ITV bid for the broadcasting rights. The offer on the table was worth just £19 million over 4 seasons. In this pre-Premier League era, the money had to feed all 92 Football League clubs. Aside from the money, the main bone of contention was the number of matches to be screened. With stadium attendances still at comparative lows, the clubs insisted on a maximum of 13 games, with only 10 in the league, along with the semi-finals and final of the League Cup. A deal for the FA Cup would be signed separately. The standoff led to Jonathan Martin, the head of sport at the BBC, saying, "Football rates itself far too highly. It has no God-given right to be on television." Another key factor in all this was the perilous financial state of many Football League clubs. It was reported that 36 of the 92 clubs were in debt. The clubs then needed to strike the perfect sweet spot, squeeze the broadcasters for the maximum amount, but don't risk them walking away without a deal. A June deadline came and went. This was now a post-Bradford, post-Heysel world. English football's worth had never been so low. Put bluntly, it was not a marketable product. So, when the 1985-86 season kicked off on the 17th of August, there was a TV blackout. Unless you went to a stadium to watch a game, you simply couldn't see any football, including highlights. Frank McAvenny's arrival at West Ham from St Mirren is the perfect example of how great the lack of exposure was. The Scottish striker struck 18 goals before Christmas 1985, yet he remained a mostly unknown entity outside of Upton Park, and this theory was put to the test. On a segment shown on St and Grevesy, Martin Tyler walked around central London with the country's leading goalscorer to see if anyone recognised him. Only a taxi driver and, remarkably, a passing Billy Connolly knew who McAvenny was. In October 1985, with the standoff setting, the Big Five, Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal, Everton and Tottenham, held talks about forming a new domestic Super League. This included a new TV package that remunerated them more handsomely as the biggest draws. The broadcasters suddenly had their own compulsion to swiftly resolve the blackout. Unsurprisingly, all parties eventually found a breakthrough in negotiations. The BBC and ITV would pay a paltry £1.3 million to show 6 live league games and 3 League Cup games for the remainder of the season. A deal for 4 FA Cup games was agreed too. Everton chairman Philip Carter said, "We believe that putting the game back on the screens will stimulate interest rather than kill it. We are anxious the more positive side of football is shown, and television is the vehicle to do that." His words are telling. When public opinion of football was at its lowest, disappearing from television was an existential threat. On Saturday the 4th of January 1986, fans could sit down to watch Portsmouth vs Aston Villa and Grimsby vs Arsenal on The Big Match. The following day, live football returned, with Charlton vs West Ham in the FA Cup. BBC commentator John Motson recalled that when Frank McAvenny finally appeared on the screen, he said, "Now you know what he looks like." The status quo may have been restored, but the seeds of the Premier League and its subscription-based TV model had been planted. By the year's end, green shoots of recovery were visible, but it would be years yet until they bore fruit. The eradication of hooliganism was still far off. Given that the European ban only applied to club competitions, there were still violent disturbances at international level with the England national team, particularly at Euro 88 in Germany. While the stadium legislation brought in after the Bradford fire was welcome, it was still woefully short. Stadiums continued to decline, and policing practices and attitudes towards football fans remained unchanged. This would ultimately come to a head in 1989. Resulting in the death of 97 Liverpool fans at Hillsborough in English football's worst and another completely avoidable tragedy. 1985 was such a bleak year, the result of such prolonged neglect, that it would take considerable time for the darkness it created to clear. In its isolation, England became something of a footballing backwater. It wasn't until the turn of the new decade that the light finally broke through again. The game it revealed was resolved to transform. It would never be the same again.